think we all can agree that 2025 has been a really big year for witches. With the rise in popularity of Gothic subculture, thanks to shows like Wednesday, the success of Chapel Roan, and the sensation that was Wicked, we're starting to see witches more and more in modern media. But what does it actually mean to be a witch? Where does this word come from, and what are witches today really like? That is what we're going to be answering today in this first part video of a two-part series I'm going to be doing. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about what are the different types of witches and how do you figure out what kind you are. Hello, welcome back to the Witch's Bedroom. My name is Wisteria Root. I'm so happy to have you here. I've been studying witchcraft for a very long time, and I'm really passionate about this subject. In the Witch's Bedroom, we study sacred sensuality and the art of womanhood through the lens of witchcraft. So today, let's define the word witch. So the definition of the word witch is really interesting because it comes from a Proto-Indo-European word. Now you might be wondering, who are the Proto-Indo-Europeans? Think the first settled civilization, the agricultural revolution, right when humanity switched from being nomadic people into domesticating animals and crops and living in one place. That change of where our food comes from created a really big shift in the way that we perceive the world. Because when we were nomadic people living off the land, the primary religions that we can find based off of archaeological evidence all comes from this reverence for the Mother Earth, seeing her as a bountiful provider that we live in harmony with. And then as we became more and more domesticated, living in one place, we started to see that we were overtaking from the resources around us. So no longer was the earth a bountiful, ever-giving resource, but it became something that we had to control, that we had to intentionally cultivate. Now, you can really see how that is a pretty big shift in the way that we view the larger world. And really, that is where we start to get the term witch from, because the Proto-Indo-European word wyk, W-E-I-K, is where we can trace that word witch all the way back to. Now, wyk means someone who can bend, shape, morph, or change things. So in our oldest definition of a witch, we see this natural ability to affect change with their will. Now, this word eventually finds its way up into the Proto-Germanic areas, Scandinavia, things like that, where we get the word wikkajaz, W-I-K-K-J-A-Z. Wikkajaz was specifically referring to a healer or a sorcerer of types, someone who was able to intermediate between the gods and humans. And something that's really important to note about this is that both of these terms were gender neutral. They weren't necessarily specifically connected to women. That idea of witchcraft actually comes on much later, because after we have wikkajaz in the Proto-Germanic tribes, eventually we get to the Old English word Wicca. And Wicca was a masculine word for a magical practitioner, a folk magic practitioner, someone who was very connected to the land, someone who was able to perform healing magic on people, or was able to sort of weave their own destiny or fate, or the fates of the people who came to them. Now, it's interesting because Wicca was the masculine, while Wicce, W-I-C-C-E, was the feminine. So we have here a very clear definition of both men and women as witches. Now, with the expansion of this word and the morphing of it, you also have to put it in the historical context of the world, because in Old England in the medieval times is when we really start to see the rise of the church and the conflict between the indigenous pagans of the land and the conquerors who were coming in, bringing their religion of a monotheistic patriarchal sky god. Now that is a very big shift. Once again, all of these are about shifts and changes, which really ties into this word witch overall, which is all about shifting and changing. Because from the 5th to the 15th century CE, witches change from being these healers, these medicine people, and they start to become demonized by church propaganda. Print blocks that were put out, pamphlets, different things that described witches as people who were making pacts with the devil, who would make agreements and work for the forces of evil and would steal your babies, things like that. And all of that comes from Christian propaganda. Now, you might be wondering, why would a healer be someone that they wanted to demonize? That question is really at the root of why we think of witches the way we do now. Because if a witch is someone who can bend, change, shift, morph, whose will affects the world in such a great way, it kind of threatens the power structure of a cultural belief system that believes that there is one true path and that you have to walk it this way. And so it kind of makes it difficult for them to assimilate into society and culture. And it also tends to create a little bit more dissonance for the rest of the community if one person is asking all of these questions. So ultimately, it ostracizes them as outcasts, as people who live on the fringes and who don't necessarily align with the culturally adopted norms. Now we get to the modern witch hunts from the 15th to the 17th century, and these actually happened all over Europe, and we see these in a lot of areas at this particular period in time because of the compounding of that evil witch stereotype. Women flying on brooms to the Sabbath, or making pacts with the devil, harming crops and children, all of those sorts of things. And there was something called the Malus Maleficarum. Malus Maleficarum, probably. This document basically spread more propaganda about witches as the scapegoats for social fears. So because of these pamphlets, these woodcuts, and these plays, they started to be exaggerated as grotesque or demonic figures. While at the same time, people who were connected to the land, pagans, druids, people who were connected to the old gods, continued to practice these traditions. And that kind of brings us into the 18th and 19th century with Enlightenment and Romanticism, where the persecution sort of fades away, but they still remain to be villainous characters in fairy tales. Think Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, things like that, where we have this wicked witch. And then we also get the rise in Gothic literature, which really romanticizes the dark side. Something that's important to think about with Enlightenment and Romanticism. The 18th and the 19th century were plagued by mass death. What happens when a lot of people die? Well, the people who are living are now stuck thinking about the afterlife, are wondering, where did my loved one go? What is their experience like, and are they okay? Now, because of that, we start to get people who are really interested in spiritualism. This is where you get Aleister Crowley and Pamela Coleman Smith, the illustrator of the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. So we start to see this really big surge in esoteric interest in occultism, especially in Europe, where they start to dive a lot into ancient Egyptian mythology and start to tie all of these kind of concepts into a new way. That's where we get Gardnerian witchcraft from, which is probably what people think about when they think of Wicca. It's a specific religion, a specific path of honoring the earth that does pull from ancient traditions, but it's a thing all of its own, and that is a totally different video, which we can dive into later. So with folklorists and storytellers happening, ostracizing witches as outsiders, at the same time that there's this rise in spiritualism, we see a big split in what we see the witch to be. And that brings us into the early 20th century, where we get kind of two caricatures of witches. You have the Halloween, evil, green-faced, wicked witch of the West, cackling and all. And then you have things, especially later on, in the 80s and 90s, where you have the domesticated witch. Think Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Charmed, anything like that, where these people are living with magic, but they're also still in their mundane life. Now, these are all examples from media, but what does it actually mean to live as a witch? I've been asking this question to a lot of the different witches that I work with, that I interact with. I've been lucky enough to be teaching these classes about witchcraft, about tarot for a couple of years now. So I've met a very diverse group to ask this question to, and the answers are really interesting. A lot of the times people will say that being a witch means being connected to the earth, bringing it all the way back to the idea of to bend or to shape. It means somebody who is able to consciously create change with their will. Another very popular answer for what is a witch is a woman. Now, there can be magical practitioners that are both men and women, but this is an answer that I get a lot. And I think that that comes because when we think about the witch trials, the propaganda has created this narrative that these witches were somehow different, that they weren't just regular women. And it would be an entirely different story if instead of killing witches, there was a mass death of women. That creates an entirely different narrative. But when you look at the story, these women were healers. They were people who understood the ways to work with the earth, the ways to create. And like I said earlier, they really challenged the societal norms. So a lot of times people will see reclaiming this word witch as reclaiming the power of womanhood, the power of your intuition, the power of your ability to nurture things, and even those darker feminine aspects of being able to create the conditions to get what you want. So as we see this reflection of witches kind of grow, we see them both become these campy villains, and we also see this deeper personal connection to personal empowerment. And it's very easy to demonize women when they're wanting to be empowered because it keeps the patriarchal structures well functioning. So then we get to the mid to late 20th century, which is where we really get like the 1970s, the 1960s, and feminism, the feminist movement. We start to see witches really emerge as empowered spiritual women. Women who are taking their spiritualities into their own hands and choosing for themselves what they want to see. At this time when we have like the hippie movements, we see people wanting to get more connected to the earth, wanting to get more connected to each other and community, to peace and things like that. And so we start to see this really big rise in witchcraft. And witchcraft is consciously creating items, talismans, clothes, food, anything like that that has intention woven into it. So it kind of turned witchcraft into something that wasn't only done by evil, bad witches or powerful healers on the edge of town, but instead it was something that you made with your girls for fun, right? You're weaving your intention into something. And then in TV and film, as that becomes more and more popular in different ways, we have shows like Bewitched. Eventually you have, like I said, Charmed, which is very significant. We have The Craft. Gothic subculture really rises. Artists like Susie and the Banshees, Stevie Nicks. I'm kind of jumping all over with the timeline here, but there are very significant witches who have been public about their practice and about their belief system. Now, what's interesting here is that there are different kinds of witches, which is what we're going to be getting into in the next video, where we talk about green witches, kitchen witches, sound witches. Like, there's so many different ways to be a witch, and that's really what we're going to talk about in the next video. But for this one, I really just want to get the picture painted of how did we go from powerful healer to Wicked Witch of the West all the way back to empowered woman. And we're almost at the end of that journey. And this is kind of the part that I think is the most interesting, and it's in the last couple of decades. Think the 90s up until now, where we have this really big pop culture boom. The Craft, Harry Potter. Witchcraft becomes kind of like a more normalized part of everyday life. Harry Potter was a huge win for pagans and for witches, because instead of it being like these evil spell-casting wizards, it's like a school of people who are learning how to be good people. Which ultimately brings me into the question of, what does it mean to be a witch? To be a rebel, to be relatable, to be somebody who seeks the unknown, who wants to understand the world around them. And that's what we really get with characters in Harry Potter, like Hermione Granger, Luna Lovegood, and even Harry himself, where he becomes this chosen one. And it's something about his magic that makes him so different from the rest of the world, which kind of brings me into what I think witches are now in the present, where they're fully embodied in the power of themselves. They believe that their uniqueness is something that is special, something that they can create from, and that they can manifest their inner world, their inner uniqueness out into the world. For some people, it's about the interconnectedness with yourself and the earth, the elements, the sky, everything. But for some people, it's just about really knowing who you are and not being willing to conform to societal structures and standards because of the main pressure. So today we see witches as queer, intersectional symbols of resistance, right? Things like American Horror Story Coven really perpetuates that. And then we get further into like the short form content world where you have things like witch talk and things like that, where it makes it much more approachable. Now, the thing that you used to have to do privately on your own and not tell anyone about, we're able to talk about, we're able to share resources on. So now we've explored a little bit about what does it mean to be a witch. I really want to know, what does it mean for you to be a witch? Are you a witch? Would you identify as a witch? Would you never identify as a witch? Have you known witches? I have a lot of questions. Please answer them in the comments below. And if you would like to dive deeper with me, I do offer personal readings. You can book them in the comment section down below. I also run the Witch's Bedroom, which is a coven where we get to explore sacred sensuality and witchcraft. So if you're wanting to have a little bit of guidance on where to go with your spiritual journey, we really focus on creating a spiritual practice that centers you as an individual and your unique path and story. I'd love to see you in there. It's only $33 a month, and you can check it out in the link below as well. So I will see you soon when you come back to the Witch's Bedroom. Bye.